There's a place deep in the Appalachian Mountains where people say the forest feels wrong. Not haunted, not cursed, just wrong. The trees grow too close together. The air feels heavy even on bright summer mornings. And the deeper you walk, the quieter everything becomes, until even the wind seems afraid to move. This place lies in the mountains of Logan County, West Virginia. Locals don't like talking about it. They simply call it the Hollow. And for nearly 50 years, hikers who wander into that hollow have been disappearing. No bodies, no tracks, no explanation, just silence. The first disappearance that truly frightened the community happened in the late 1970s. Before that, people occasionally got lost in the Appalachian wilderness. That wasn't unusual. These mountains are ancient, older than most landscapes on Earth, and their forests can swallow a person quickly. But what happened in the summer of 1978 didn't feel like someone simply getting lost. It began with a young photographer named Daniel Reeves. Daniel had been traveling across the Appalachian region, documenting remote trails and forgotten landscapes. He loved places where few people went, places where the forest still felt untouched. He arrived one humid evening in the small town of Logan, West Virginia. The town itself looked like many others in the region: quiet streets, old storefronts, and mountains rising like dark walls in every direction. Daniel checked into a small roadside motel run by an older man named Walter Grayson. Walter had lived in the county his entire life. He knew every road, every ridge, every creek, and he knew the places people shouldn't go. That night, Daniel asked him a simple question. "Any trails around here that tourists don't know about?" Walter paused. "Not long, but just long enough for something uneasy to settle in the room." "There are plenty," he finally said, "but some of them are better left alone." Daniel smiled. "Those are exactly the kind I'm looking for." Walter sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You ever heard of the hollow north of the county line?" Daniel shook his head. Walter stared at him for a moment. "The woods there don't behave right." Daniel chuckled, assuming it was just Appalachian folklore. Walter didn't laugh. He leaned closer across the desk. "People who go in there say the forest changes. Trails move, landmarks disappear. You'll swear you're walking in a straight line, but somehow you end up right back where you started." Daniel shrugged. "Sounds like a good story for my article." Walter shook his head slowly. "It ain't a story." Daniel left early the next morning. The sky was clear, the summer sun already burning through the morning mist as he drove north toward the mountains. He followed a narrow road that twisted through thick forest for nearly an hour before it ended at a dirt turnout. That was the last place anyone ever saw him. 2 days later, his car was still there, doors locked, backpack inside, camera sitting on the passenger seat. But Daniel Reeves had vanished. At first, local authorities assumed he'd gotten lost. Search teams entered the forest immediately. Volunteers from nearby towns joined the effort. Dogs were brought in to track his scent. At first, the dogs followed a trail that led deep into the hollow. Then something strange happened. About half a mile into the forest, the dogs stopped. Not slowed down, stopped. Handlers tried to push them forward, but the animals refused. They whined, pulled backward, and one of them even tried to break free from its leash. It was as if something ahead terrified them. Eventually, the handlers were forced to continue without the dogs. Search teams spent 6 days combing the hollow. They found nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing, no equipment, no signs of a struggle, just forest, and an unsettling silence that many volunteers later said they couldn't explain. One of them described it years later in an interview. "The woods felt empty, not quiet, empty, like something had scared everything else away." After a week, the search was called off. Daniel Reeves became another missing person, and for a while, the hollow faded back into quiet obscurity. But the forest wasn't finished. Over the next decade, small incidents continued to occur. Hikers reported strange experiences inside the hollow. Some said they heard footsteps behind them, even when no one was there. Others claimed the woods seemed to distort direction. Trails that should lead downhill suddenly climbed upward. Familiar landmarks appeared in places they hadn't been before. One man insisted he had walked for 2 hours in a straight line, only to emerge at the exact same clearing where he started. Most people dismissed these stories as imagination, until the disappearances began again. In 1986, two friends, Mark Holloway and Chris Dalton, entered the hollow during a weekend hiking trip. Both were experienced outdoorsmen. They carried maps, compasses, enough supplies for 2 days. When they didn't return home Sunday night, their families contacted authorities. Search teams once again entered the forest. This time they found something. About 3 miles inside the hollow, searchers discovered Chris Dalton's backpack. It was sitting upright against a tree. Inside were supplies, water bottles, and his compass. But one detail made investigators uneasy. The compass needle spun wildly, even when the device was placed on flat ground. No one could explain why. Mark Holloway and Chris Dalton were never found. After that case, the hollow gained a reputation among locals. People began avoiding it entirely. Hunters refused to set traps there. Even experienced hikers stayed away. But the forest has a strange way of drawing curious people toward it, especially those who don't believe the stories. In 1999, a group of 4 college students decided to explore the hollow for a documentary project. They wanted to investigate the legends and prove the stories were exaggerated. Their plan was simple: hike in, camp overnight, film the experience, leave the next morning. At first, everything seemed normal. Their footage, later recovered from a damaged camera, showed them laughing, joking, setting up camp beside a narrow creek deep inside the valley. But around midnight, something changed. The audio recording captured it first. A sound, faint at first, then clearer. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the forest around their camp. One of the students whispered, "Did you hear that?" The camera shifted toward the darkness between the trees. Nothing visible, just black woods and the faint sound of leaves crunching somewhere beyond the light of their campfire. The footsteps circled the campsite for nearly 10 minutes. Then they stopped. Suddenly, as if whatever had been moving realized it was being watched. The next morning, 3 of the students left the hollow. The 4th one never made it out. His name was Andrew Collins. According to the others, Andrew woke up early and walked a short distance from camp to film the sunrise. He never returned. Search teams later found his camera lying beside the creek. The footage ended with a strange final scene. The camera pointed toward the trees, and in the distance, barely visible between the trunks, something tall moved slowly behind the fog. Then the video cut to static. Andrew Collins vanished like the others. After that incident, the hollow's reputation grew darker. Even skeptics began to question what was happening in those woods. Some blamed the terrain. The hollow sits inside a maze of steep ridges and hidden ravines where GPS signals often fail. Others believed underground cave systems might exist beneath the forest, swallowing hikers who wandered too close. But local residents had another theory, one older than the disappearances themselves. Long before modern towns existed in these mountains, indigenous tribes avoided the hollow entirely. They believed the valley was a place where the boundary between worlds became thin, a place where something old moved beneath the trees, something that didn't like visitors. Whether those stories are legend or warning, no one knows. But even today, hikers occasionally find their way to the edge of the hollow. And sometimes they step inside. Because the forest still looks beautiful from the outside. Tall trees, cool mountain air, sunlight filtering through the leaves. It doesn't look dangerous, not until you walk far enough in to realize something disturbing. The birds stop singing, the wind fades, and the deeper you go, the quieter the world becomes. As if the forest itself is waiting, and the moment you notice the silence, you might already be too far inside to leave. For nearly 20 years after the disappearance of Andrew Collins, the hollow returned to silence. No new incidents, no new searches, no hikers brave or foolish enough to wander deep into that valley. The forest simply waited, Over time, the stories became local legend. Older residents warned newcomers about the place, but many outsiders assumed the tales were exaggerated. After all, remote wilderness areas are dangerous. People get lost in forests every year. But something about this hollow felt different, and in the fall of 2021, someone finally decided to find out why. His name was Michael Carter. Michael wasn't a thrill seeker or a ghost hunter. He was an investigative journalist who specialized in unexplained disappearances across rural America. Over the years, he had covered dozens of strange cases, missing hikers in national parks, unexplained vanishings in desert regions, even maritime mysteries along isolated coastlines. But when he first heard about the disappearances connected to the Hollow in Logan County, West Virginia, something about the pattern caught his attention. The victims had different backgrounds, different ages, different hiking experience. But the disappearances shared three disturbing similarities. They all occurred within the same narrow stretch of forest. Search teams never found meaningful physical evidence, and nearly every witness described the same strange environmental change, an unnatural silence deep inside the woods. Michael spent 3 months researching the cases before deciding to visit the area himself. He arrived in the small Appalachian town of Logan, West Virginia, late one October evening. Autumn had already settled into the mountains. The forests were a mix of deep orange leaves and dark shadows stretching across the ridges. The hollow lay about 40 minutes north of town, and according to locals, it hadn't changed in decades. The next morning, Michael began interviewing residents. Most people refused to talk about it. Some simply shook their heads and walked away. But one man finally agreed to speak. His name was Thomas Grayson, and when Michael heard the name, something clicked. Thomas was the son of Walter Grayson, the motel owner, who had warned Daniel Reeves about the hollow in 1978. Thomas had grown up hearing stories about the forest, but he also knew something more disturbing. His father had visited the hollow only once, and when he came back, he never went near it again. Michael met Thomas in a small diner near the edge of town. Rain tapped softly against the windows as they spoke. Thomas leaned forward across the table. "My father told me something before he died," he said quietly. Michael switched on his recorder. "What did he say?" Thomas hesitated. Then he said something that made the room feel colder. "He said the forest isn't empty in that hollow." Michael raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Thomas looked out the window toward the distant mountains. "My father was part of the search team looking for Daniel Reeves back in '78. He never told the police this, but he told me years later." Michael waited. Thomas continued. "On the third day of the search, the team split into groups to cover more ground. My father and two other men followed a trail deeper into the valley than anyone else." He paused. When they reached the bottom of the hollow, they found something strange. "What?" Thomas lowered his voice. "A campsite." Michael frowned. "That's not unusual." Thomas shook his head. This one was. According to Walter Grayson, the campsite looked abandoned, but not old. A fire pit still contained warm ash. 2 sleeping bags were laid out beside it, and 3 backpacks sat neatly beside a fallen log. But no people, no footprints, no signs of struggle, just empty gear, as if the hikers had simply stood up and walked away at the same moment. The strangest part was what happened next. Walter and the other men began searching the surrounding forest. They walked in widening circles for nearly an hour, but when they returned to the campsite, it was gone, completely gone. The fire pit, the backpacks, the sleeping bags, everything had vanished, as if the campsite had never existed. Michael stared at Thomas. "You're saying your father imagined it?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "My father wasn't the kind of man who imagined things. The rain outside grew heavier, and that wasn't the only thing he saw." Michael leaned closer. "What else?" Thomas looked uneasy. He said while they were searching, he heard someone walking behind him. Michael waited. When he turned around, there was nothing there, but he said he could still hear the footsteps, slow, careful, like someone was following him just out of sight. Michael felt a chill crawl up his spine, and then, Thomas said quietly, the forest went silent. Michael had read those same words in several disappearance reports. What happened next? Thomas exhaled slowly. My father said the silence felt wrong. No wind, no birds, no insects, nothing. He rubbed his hands together nervously. Then one of the men in the search party screamed. Michael straightened in his chair. What did he see? Thomas shook his head. He never said. The man just pointed toward the trees, then ran. All three of them ran. Michael asked the obvious question. Did they go back? Thomas laughed once dry and humorless. My father refused to even drive near the hollow again. That conversation convinced Michael of one thing. He needed to see the hollow himself. 3 days later, he stood at the edge of the same dirt road where Daniel Reeves's car had been discovered decades earlier. The forest looked peaceful. Tall Appalachian trees stretched toward the sky, their leaves glowing orange and gold in the autumn light. It looked like the perfect place for a hike. Michael activated his body camera and began walking. At first, the forest felt normal. Leaves crunched under his boots. A light breeze moved through the branches overhead. Birds called in the distance. But about 40 minutes into the hike, things began to change. The wind faded first. Then the birds stopped. The deeper Michael walked, the quieter the forest became, until finally the silence arrived. Not natural silence, something heavier, as if the entire valley had suddenly emptied of life. Michael checked his GPS device. The screen flickered. Then the signal vanished. He tried his phone. No reception. The forest around him looked darker now, even though the sun was still high above the ridges. Michael kept walking. Another 15 minutes passed before he noticed something strange. Footprints. Fresh footprints in the dirt trail ahead of him. They looked human, but they weren't hiking boots. They were bare feet. Michael crouched down and studied them. They were deep impressions, as if whoever made them had been standing there for a long time. But the trail ahead was empty. The footprints simply stopped. Right in the middle of the path, Michael slowly stood up, and that's when he heard it. A sound behind him, leaves crunching, footsteps, slow, careful, following him through the forest. Michael turned quickly. The trail behind him was empty, but the sound had been real. He knew it. He waited. The forest remained silent. Then something moved between the trees. Just for a second, a tall, dark shape shifting through the fog deeper in the hollow. Michael lifted his camera. "Hello?" he called. No response. He stepped forward slowly. The fog thickened. The trees seemed closer together now. And then he noticed something that made his stomach drop. The trail was gone. The path he had been following had simply disappeared. There was only forest in every direction. Michael checked his compass. The needle spun wildly, just like the one investigators had found in Chris Dalton's backpack decades earlier. Another sound echoed through the hollow. This one distant, a voice, faint, calling from somewhere deep in the forest. "Help!" Michael froze. The voice sounded human, weak, desperate, but something about it felt wrong. It repeated again, "Help!" The sound echoed through the trees, but it didn't seem to come from one direction. It came from everywhere. Michael slowly backed away, because in that moment he realized something terrifying. The voice didn't sound like a lost hiker. It sounded like someone trying to lure him deeper into the hollow. And as the fog thickened around him, the footsteps started again, closer this time, just behind him. Slow, patient, following